This is Real Communication with your host, Victor Vogel. Hi, welcome to Real Communication. This is where we talk to real people about their actual communication. I'm Vic Vogel, and today we have with us a gentleman who probably experiences it from a different light than a vast majority of us do. In this case, Gary Noesner, who is the individual who was a chief hostage negotiator for the FBI for years and was the first person to hold that position. But he also covered airline hostage situations in the Mideast, just a host of things that really were life and death scenarios that most of us don't have to deal with on a regular basis. So we're going to get a chance to hear how Gary makes that work. So welcome, Gary, to the podcast. I appreciate you very much being here.
Hi, Vic. It's great to be with you today and have a chat.
Good. Let me just jump right into it. And we got a lot of information to cover in a short period of time, but I kind of see this breaking down into two positions. One of them is in communication, often it's how we connect with someone that defines the result we're going to get out of that. And so I'd like to talk about that a little bit, and you can bring up any kinds of experiences or examples you think will help us understand that. And then the second segment that I'd like to delve into a little bit is using communication to connect behaviorally. When you send a message to somebody, a lot of times it's less about what you think the message and how you think that person is going to receive that message than they actually receive it. So there's a lot of aspects I noticed in some of your previous work in Stalling for Time, your book, which is great. I read it 5 times and I'm still reading it and pulling information out of it. It's also stuff I saw in your series that came out of Waco, when the bumps and grinds and the processes that were necessary to get where you needed to get, because you saved a lot of people out of that hostage situation, and so we're going to really kind of delve into that. So if you could kind of maybe walk me through some steps. Let's say if you can think about a situation when you first came in that you would like to talk about, and just talk to me about what you're trying to do the minute your foot hits the ground and you don't have a lot of information about what's going on with something, and how you make that connection. What are the things? And we'll just kind of dialogue about that.
Well, when we respond to an incident, there's a high likelihood that we're dealing with someone that's having the worst day of their life. I mean, if an FBI negotiator or police negotiator is on the other end of the phone, things aren't going too well for you. So there's a lot of high emotion. There's a lot of angst and tension. And the first and most important thing we have to do is de-escalate the conversation we're having, to lower the temperature, as it were. And we know if we listen to someone thoughtfully, it will help us create a relationship of trust where we can gain this person's cooperation. In my former life, the individual we would be dealing with would typically expect a very authoritative, very demanding, very commanding police voice, and instead they get somebody who says, "Hey, my name's Gary, and I'm here to help you." It's not what they expect. And if we then invest the time in listening to what problems they're having, what prompted their behaving in a way that's brought them to our attention. Everybody thinks all these hostage situations are the most dangerous. And in reality, they're only about 10% of what police negotiators do. That is when someone holds another to try to compel somebody to comply with a demand. That's a quid pro quo thing. If you don't let my brother out of prison, I'm going to kill this person. Well, they're there to get their brother out of prison, not to die. So that helps us, first of all, know that, they came in with high expectations, feeling that holding a hostage could compel us to do whatever they want. And then when time passes by and they don't get what they want, we don't jump through their hoops, they begin to realize slowly and steadily that they're not in as much control as they thought. And eventually they're left with the options of cooperate or run the risk of being seriously injured or killed. Fortunately, in hostage situations, almost all of them end well when the person eventually comes to that correct decision and realizes their best option is to peacefully comply. But 90% of what law enforcement does are responding to people who are in a really tough situation, an emotionally charged situation, where they don't have a clear goal, they don't have a clear purpose, they're not even sure what they're trying to accomplish. And the one thing that we typically hear from them is their demand that we go away and leave them alone, which, if there's been some act of violence that have prompted our response, we're unable to do. So in those situations, our task is to deal with the emotions and to deal with the trauma this person's going through, and to bring them to a point where they're thinking more clearly. Vic, I always illustrate a child's playground teeter-totter, the seesaw, up and down, up and down. And I always like to characterize it this way: when emotions are high, rational thinking and behavior are low. And I don't think that can be argued. I think that is always the case. So our first task is not to come up with some brilliant argument that's going to solve whatever issues they're dealing with, but rather to get that emotional content lowered. And when we do, look what happens. Rational thinking and rational behavior comes back up to where it should be. And that's basically how the process works. People want to be listened to, they want to be understood, they want to be respected. And, as we always say, listening is the cheapest concession we can provide. And it's the pathway through which we demonstrate that we're worthy of their respect in turn. And we get to a point where somebody might say, I just don't know how to get out of this. I'm so angry at my girlfriend. She said she's going to leave me, and part of me wants to kill her and kill myself. And, I just don't know what to do. And when we get to that point, I might say, well, it's a tough situation you're in. And I know you have strong emotions about it, but you're asking me what I would do. And, here's some thoughts that I have, that you might want to think about. Again, it's a different profile than they expect from law enforcement. And we copy a bit from the mental health field, the counseling field, and we create this relationship of trust. And I've seen it work so many, many times. And it's really the number one core set of skills that we teach negotiators, to actively listen. And I'll just say one last thing and move on to whatever else you want to ask. But we call it active listening because unlike what some people feel, listening is not a passive endeavor. It's an active endeavor. And by that, I mean, we respond. We ask open-ended questions. We label in our words the emotional feelings that we're seeing being manifested. We repeat the core of the story that the person said. Your girlfriend's leaving you because of this or that or whatever it might be. And because of that, you're devastated. You just don't know where to turn, and so forth and so on. When I am successful in relaying not only what this person is experiencing and how they feel about it, I'm not just telling him I understand, I'm demonstrating it. I'm proving it to him. And we've learned that that is the most powerful pathway for relationship building that we know of. It's the best pathway for communications. And it's not just in the crisis situations that I worked, which few people will have to confront, but in the boardroom, in your living room at home, in your backyard with a dispute you're having with your neighbor over where the fence is going to get built. Who knows? But, if we take the time to control our emotions and listen thoughtfully and respond back, while there's no guarantee for success, we certainly greatly improve the likelihood that we're going to accomplish what we want.
Yeah, I feel that same thing when I was consulting in communication. And you mentioned two things I think that I'd like to probe just a little bit here in this segment. One of them is trust. And one of the things I found was critical for establishing trust. I used to call them the 4 C's. Used to be uh, compassion, definitely compassion. And then congruency, the ability for what you're saying is somehow felt and believed by the other person to be what you actually mean. Okay, which it sounds like is important to your interaction with your subjects. The third one was consistency. That if you seem to come across inconsistent, people have a little more trouble believing what you're saying. And then the last one, of course, was competency. In order for somebody to feel comfortable with you, particularly from the business, I can't speak to your side of it, but from the business side, a leader who is not seen as competent in their world people tend to have a little. So establishing trust, there's more to it than just saying establishing trust. There's a lot of those component pieces are critical. The other thing that struck me in what you said, and I'd like to just probe you with these two things in that order: the trust, and then this, which was the feedback loop. It seems to me that in your situation, when you first, now you kind of let me know if I'm wrong here, but when you first step onto the ground for your get out of your call and you arrive and you step your foot on the ground, you don't have any feedback loop initially with this person.
No, it's true. Very often we have very little information. A lot of times the information continues to pour in with other law enforcement personnel digging up this person's personal history, criminal
Right.
history, mental health history, and all that. But typically that's not in your lap as you start that
Right.
initial conversation. So you have to really focus on what you're hearing from them and what they're saying.
So that's what, okay.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's important, and frankly, I've long disagreed with those departments that purposely wait too long to make that contact because they say we don't have all the information we want yet. The SWAT team's not here yet, and so let's not call him up. And I used to ask, well, why not? And they said, well, what if he surrenders and we're not ready? And I said, well, I may not be Mr. Super SWAT, but if the guy really wants to surrender, I'll figure a way to make it happen,
Right.
and without endangering myself or anybody else. But I think communicating early and often, it does so many things. It allows us to direct that person's attention towards us versus, say, a hostage or a victim inside. It keeps them from running around the house, looking out the window, and overreacting to relatively routine things they see, but they might view it as aggressive movement by police, setting up
Right.
somebody behind the back woodshed or whatever it might be. We think that's perfectly innocent and normal, but the person inside's perspective is the only one that really counts. So, I mean, armed with very little information, I feel fairly comfortable in most cases opening up a dialogue to find out that information. Hey, I just got here and I understand there were some shots fired out the window, and can you tell me what's going on? I'm really concerned. Is anybody hurt in there? Or are you hurt? Are you okay? And could you let me know what prompted all of this? That's fine. There's nothing inappropriate in that. And, I call it verbal containment.
Yeah.
We always in law enforcement think in the context of physical containment, but I believe in verbal containment. And I think it's a very powerful thing. So, yeah, a lot of times we start a dialogue and are trying to create a relationship where we have relatively little to go on. And, we're not going to spend weeks and weeks and weeks developing this friendship. It's got to be in a fairly short period of time. But yet it works in the 90 percentile, and it's because, when we do our jobs well as a negotiation team, and it is a team activity, we are, again, presenting for this person something that is not what they expected from police. It's a kinder, gentler, more empathic response. So that's why I say, Vic, if this will work with some guy that's already killed somebody, he's holding a gun, then certainly it will work when you're having a dispute with your with your coworker.
Right.
Um, yeah, so I mean, I really think I don't know if that fully or adequately addressed your question. I know there were
Yeah.
two parts.
Well, actually, you came up with a couple of things that kind of put the two parts together. The idea of the person believing you to start with is very important, and that feedback loop when you first come in, the more you, which is something I took out of your book a lot. The longer you can keep this going, the more likely that other person is going to be able to um, uh, develop the trust in you that they feel comfortable what you are saying. And so when you stop that process, when that feedback loop is cut off, and there are a lot of things in the actual communication process. I mean, we don't tend to think about it every day because we're like, it seems normal, like we're just talking, so it seems normal. But there's a lot of dynamics, like getting your microphone to work, that can block that. So I'm thinking, like in your situation, there are a lot of, and they're not just mechanical things. They're also human things that can get in the way. Other people who disagree with what you ought to be doing, that try to push you one way versus another. All of these things, unfortunately, while they're transpiring, say your team, within your team, around your team, both internal and external influences on you, the guy who's in that, or whoever's in that guy, gal, whoever is in there, other side of this, who you're talking to, they have to read what you're saying. So I always operate under the principle that I learned, I don't know, 20, 25 years ago, and it's always stuck with me and it's always worked well. The meaning of the message is in the mind of the receiver of that message. So there's a lot between you as a negotiator, your team as a negotiator, the people who are impacting all of those negotiations that can impact they can cut off the feedback loop. They can send an incongruent message. If you're sitting there saying, "Trust me, I want to help you," and you have SWAT team members moving to the front of the building and that person can see that, that's kind of an incongruent message. And so have
You're
you
very
ever,
right.
go ahead.
Well, the trust factor is a big one. I mean, that happened in a situation in Berkeley many years ago. Sort of a disturbed guy took over a pub, Henry's Pub in Berkeley, and had a bunch of students and other people in there. And negotiators are trying to communicate and set up a relationship. And they have a TV on in the bar, and this guy's watching TV, and he sees a SWAT team moving up the sidewalk
Right.
towards the entrance of the bar. And that didn't. You can imagine how that how that was received by him. No, trust is not just what the person hears over the phone, but what they see outside. It's a problem we ran into in Waco. The negotiators are saying one thing, and the tanks are being very, aggressive as they look out their windows. That is incongruent, and it's important that everybody be on the same sheet of music. And trust has to be earned. It doesn't come automatically because of your rank or what association you work for. That's why we're very careful, even small things. If this guy says, "I'll give you a hostage if you bring me some food," and if a negotiator, and hopefully that doesn't happen very often, but it says, "We'll have it here in 10 minutes." Well, what if it doesn't get here for 20 minutes or 30 minutes? Now you've lost some credibility. Or you say, "I'm going to leave the food," he says, "Leave the food out front by the front door." And then the SWAT team takes it up and they say, "That's too close. We're going to leave it down at the corner." You know, is this a setup? Is this a ruse? Am I being fooled? It's really important that all those things get really well coordinated and they convey the same message. We would say, "I'm going to look into getting you some food so we can make this exchange happen. I'll get it coming as quickly as I can, but I'm not going to put a firm time on it because I don't I don't know where it's coming from or how long it's going to take. There's a lot of traffic out there. Look out the window. You can see there's a lot of people here. So, I'll let you know as soon as it gets to the scene. Don't paint yourself in a corner by promising more than you can deliver, which in essence damages trustworthiness. And you don't want that. Other instances would be when a perpetrator would say, hey, am I going to get charged with anything if I put my gun down and come out? Well, there's an inclination for negotiators to say, oh, you'll be fine. Don't worry about it. Just put your gun down. It's no big deal. You'll be able to go home tonight, knowing damn well the guy's not going to. And that's a terrible mistake because you may see this fellow again sometime. You have to say, listen, I'm not a judge. I'm not a jury. This was a serious matter, and I'm sure there's somebody going to have to conduct an investigation. I don't know if charges will be pressed or if so, what they will be. But what's really going to be important is that you behave in a way that will show to the judge that you were reasonable and you didn't want to hurt anybody. And I'm willing to speak to the judge on your behalf about that. That's stuff you can do that is believable and helps establish trust. Most of these guys that we dealt with in my former life have a bit of history with law enforcement. And they know if you overly minimize the difficulty they're in, they just know you're phony and you're faking them. They're realistic enough to say, yeah, this is pretty serious. You seriously wounded that police officer. And, I don't know what his condition is, but, let's talk about how you and I are going to get you out of this safely now. We don't need to worry about that other thing right now. There's a lot of ways we would try to deflect them from trying to press us into giving them a promise that we just can't keep.
I think that's interesting because you watch a lot of TV shows today. I'm big on conspiracy theories and all those. I'm not big on conspiracy theories, but the movies about them entertain me well. But what I find interesting about that is in a lot of these shows, there's always a conflict between the operations team and the negotiating team. That's a big theme that makes the show exciting. So when you are in a real situation, is that a normal process most of the time, or is it more of an exception? And then secondly, how do you as a negotiator work through that as successfully as you can?
It has historically been a big issue. Law enforcement is essentially a paramilitary organization, and our tactical teams are the most extreme, edification of that paramilitary perspective. So they're trained to do these dynamic assaults and try to rescue hostages and apprehend dangerous guys. So it shouldn't surprise anyone that that's what they feel they're good at and they want to do it. And they're confident that they can prevail. My job as a negotiator, despite how they may feel about it, is to keep them safe by resolving the situation so they don't have to go in. We've lost a lot of police officers through the years in situations, and invariably, it's when they make an entry. And oftentimes when you do a post-mortem on that incident, you'll find that that entry was probably premature, that it wasn't at the point yet where we had to take that action. I've always been a big believer in the law enforcement philosophy that we use no more force than it's absolutely necessary. And if we use force, we have to be able to stand in front of a court of law, a court of public opinion, and say, look at these demonstrated behaviors and threats from the perpetrator that brought us to a point of believing that if we didn't try to intervene, that there was definitely going to be innocent life lost. So we felt we had no other choice. And if that's compelling, the public will support police. But if we use that force just because we can, or we're tired, or it's the weather's bad, or whatever it might be, that doesn't cut it. So you try to. In most progressive police departments, the tactical teams and the negotiators have a pretty good working relationship. In some departments, the negotiators are often subordinated to the tactical team commander, so they're probably on the same team. We always did it separately in the FBI because we wanted the on-scene commander, the decision maker, to have two independent assessments of what's going on. So it might say, Mr. Negotiator, tell me what you think is going on and what's the prognosis for success. And that's either good or bad, and I have to articulate it. I can't just say, yeah, it's good or it's bad. I have to be able to enumerate what factors lead me to that conclusion, and at the same time, the on-scene commander may say to the tactical commander, what are your options for getting inside? Can you do it swiftly, safely? How confident are you that you can apprehend the perpetrator? And based on those independent and more often than not complementary inputs, the on-scene commander makes the decision. But clearly, when we talk about Waco, that was a case where the FBI had departed from its longstanding policy and that coordination, and where the tactical side was had a philosophical belief that exerting an extra ratcheting up the pressure would force people to come out, where the negotiation team that I led said, no, it's counterproductive. The harder we push, the more they're going to resist. And there was a philosophical disconnect that created a lot of problems for us. And after Waco, we went back to doing it the way we had prior and had other significant successes like Montana and other places. But there is some departments around the country where decision makers, sheriffs, and chiefs are more comfortable with tactics than they are with negotiations. Negotiations is sort of this warm and fuzzy gray thing that they don't really know about, where they know we'll go out and watch the SWAT team train and watch them throw a flashbang grenade and go into a building, and they can see that in a very visceral way how that works. How the negotiation process works, most of them don't have the time or the experience to really understand the complexities of it. And unless they take the time to learn that, that's why I tell negotiation leaders, you really got to step up to the plate and educate your boss at the scene. This is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, and this is why I need your support to continue doing it, and this is why I need the tactical team not to do something that is, unwittingly going to undercut that effort. We need to, everything the perpetrator sees, whether it's looking out the window or hearing over the TV set or over the telephone talking to the negotiator, it all needs to convey essentially the same message. We're here to work with you to get this resolved peacefully. And if we don't do that, we're likely to face the ramifications of that in a negative way. So, I think, there's always that. The police shows do tend to exaggerate that aspect. It's not unknown. It does happen. The Waco Netflix, the 6-part Waco series that I was involved in, it certainly highlights that problem that we had in the FBI at Waco, and that was unfortunate. Even though we had those problems, I think it's still reasonable and appropriate to say that David Koresh was ultimately still the culprit for what happened, but that doesn't mean that we performed as well as we should have and could have.
Well, by the way, Waco is a great show to use for training people about education. You can pull segments out of that show, even though they may have been enhanced by the producer for the fact. But there are a lot of great points in that show that teach the concepts about what happens when your feedback loop gets cut off, what happens when you're incongruent in your messaging, and what happens when your subject feels like there's no sincere desire to understand their feelings, for example, was a great point I picked up out of that show. I could use that film for forever, teaching points about how leaders and which brings to the point here I'd like to touch on, and that is when you're involved with that team around you. You obviously have to do some things to overcome some of those things that you just mentioned that bring that team together. How do you go about approaching that?
Do you mean the tactical team?
Or both. How do you get them all together? And what could happen, say, if you have 5 negotiators, and what could break down in that process that could cause things to fall apart? So there's just a lot of points in there about the aspect of making sure active. I mean, if you have 5 negotiators, are all of them pretty good at active listening, or you know?
Well, when I got into negotiations, back in 1980, nobody heard of active listening, and it's something that I incorporated into our curriculum in 1990, and it spread throughout the United States. And probably in 1989 and 90, you'd go to a negotiation conference and you'd say, has anybody ever heard of active listening skills? And you get 1, maybe 2 hands out of 100 people. Not everybody, it's the bread and butter of what we do. There's a different personality that's attracted to negotiations versus tactics, generally speaking. I mean, these are generalizations. But negotiators tend to be a little more experienced law enforcement officers. They're very good interviewers, interrogators. They get confessions. They develop informants. They're very good with the communication skills, and that's what attracts them to become negotiators. And it's fairly unusual to have real acrimony in the negotiation team. We structure ourselves so we converse pretty openly about assessing the situation and trying to come up with a good strategy to move forward. So we don't have too many problems there. But what I've found is the real challenge is the crisis within the crisis, and that is educating the on-scene commander and executive staff, and making sure the tactical commander is on the same sheet of music. I used to tell my team, particularly the latter years of my career where I wasn't on the phone anymore, I was leading the team, and I would say, listen, what you guys do is pretty easy. We kind of know how to talk to bad guys. That's kind of our thing. We probably won't see a lot of surprises today. I'm not saying it's not challenging, but we kind of know what to expect. I said, but my job's tougher. I've got to negotiate with the bosses, and they have no idea. And so probably the greatest skill set that I was able to employ in situations was being an instructor. And teaching police all over the world negotiations allowed me to, in essence, pull out a proverbial chalkboard and say, okay, boss, here's why we do what we do. And to cite statistics and examples and say, this is why I need your support for us to do this versus that. And that's served me quite well in those situations, because bosses, more often than not, there are a few that feel as though they know everything about everything, and typically they don't, but most of them are smart enough to know that this is such a highly specialized area that they might be well advised to listen to somebody that has done this an awful lot and has had a very significant track record of success. And so, I mean, I played that to good advantage as my career went on, but you still have to make your case. You still have to articulate why you want to do something. But it's kind of like the 3-ring circus, Vic. There's a lot of things going on. It's not just on one negotiator on the phone with one bad guy, as TV so often projects. It's a team of negotiators. It's mental health people listening in to provide input. It's tactical coordination. It's talking with the on-scene commander. It's preparing briefing papers. There's a lot of moving parts of this if it's done well and if it's a complex situation.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And I'd like, just before we close here, because I don't want to take any more of your time up, today we have 2 groups of people lined up in the street against each other. And I'm just wondering, again, there's so many barriers to the active listening you're talking about as one tool, and just the whole idea of understanding where each of those groups are coming from. They both take postures. They both have decided this is the only way. They line up in the streets with clubs and weapons now, and they start screaming at each other. And I'm wondering from a law enforcement perspective, I've seen, for example, people up here in Michigan who literally went in and talked to these groups before they began to have their rallies. I mean, literally went in the midst of the group, was beginning to try to understand some of these concepts that we've been talking about, to get that group diffused a little so they can understand, whether it was Black Lives Matter or Proud Boy, it doesn't make any difference. Both of them tend to respond when you step in the middle of them and at least start that dialogue process. Is that something that we need to begin?
I think so. I mean, first of all, comment that if it's a riot, don't sit down the street and try to negotiate a riot. That's you were past the prevention point at that point. However, when I was watching the protests from months ago around the country, the important point to remember is when people are motivated enough to make signs, gather, and walk down the street, they're basically saying, we're upset about something and we want to be heard. We want to be understood. We want to be listened to. We're not happy with something. And in law enforcement, we have a natural inclination to want to suppress that potential problem. But in reality, we might need to find creative ways to let them know that we're listening, which removes the necessity to become violent to get our attention. And I saw this, I'm not going to name them, but I saw some video of some police departments where the chief or the sheriff was out there walking with the protesters. Some of the police officers were being very respectful. And in those cities, there tended to be a lot less violent confrontation. In other places, I thought some of the response was a little too heavy-handed and was counterproductive. I mean, I look at the Lafayette Square thing across from the White House. I watched that video and different variations of it. People are standing around there and doing whatever they're doing. The next thing you know, they're getting gassed and clubbed. And what do you expect? People are going to respond to that in kind. So I think in law enforcement, we have to realize that we can get more with honey than vinegar sometimes, and we have to be creative. And that's not a guarantee to success, of course. These are polarizing times, and people have very strong views one way or another about certain issues. But I think in law enforcement, our job is essentially to my screen just went weird there. Can you still see?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. All right. Well, what I was going to say is, I think it's important that we try to find a way that people can feel they've been listened to and respected. And that's not going to stop all violence. I mean, when somebody's an arsonist or, whatever, you got to go arrest that person, and police have to do what they have to do pretty decisively. But if someone's really protesting, we could probably engage with them in a manner that reduces, if not eliminates, but certainly reduces the chance that they will feel a need to be more demonstrative and more physically threatening. And that's about the best we can do. We can really step in to try to turn this a different direction, and we can be successful. And there will be those cases where that may not be successful, but it should always be tried, in my opinion.
Yeah, okay, and I think that's right. I have one last question for you, and it has to do with compromise. I'm not a big fan of compromise personally. It's a lose-lose scenario in my mind. Is compromise something that you used effectively in negotiations? Was it a premise, or where somebody gave up something and both groups gave up something and walked away, but both groups weren't satisfied? Did you often have compromise involved in your process, or was it more of a collaboration process?
We did have some compromise, but not on the major core issues. For example, if you sense the guy was ready to surrender, but and you're tactically wanting to come out the front door, where they've decided this is where the in custody operation will take place. And he's just reluctant because he doesn't want to be seen on front of his house. Can we compromise and figure out a way to let him surrender out the back door? Well, if it doesn't jeopardize safety, that's a compromise that I'm willing to make. I don't really even consider that a compromise because we essentially accomplished what we wanted to.
Right.
But compromise has become sort of a dirty word amongst business negotiators, and I'm not sure that that it should. I mean, I think showing flexibility and creativity. You know, I talk in my book about a situation where a guy climbed a radio tower and was going to commit suicide, and you know, he was 100 feet up, and the police couldn't hear him, and they called me up for some advice, and I asked if the fellow asked for anything, and he said he wanted a cigarette, and I said, well, did you give it to him? And they said, no. What do we get for it? I said, what do you expect him to do? You know, take one of his arms off and throw it down to you? I mean, he obviously is doing what he's doing not to get a cigarette. Something else brought him to this time and place, some other issues, some, you know, psychological concerns or whatever it might be. So I said, why don't we demonstrate to him that we're here not to make his life worse, but to try to help him. So let's give him a cigarette. You know, there used to be a saying in my business, never give somebody something unless you get something in return. And that's fine in a quid pro quo bargaining hostage situation. But in 90% of what we do, a demonstration of our good faith and our respectfulness can go an awful long way in helping convey to someone that, you know, we're not the big old bad police. We're not here to just beat you up and make you do what we want. You know, we want to help you if we can. And so, would you call that a compromise? I don't know. Maybe that's not the right term, but I'm willing to be flexible and creative in finding ways to demonstrate to somebody that we want to work with them in a positive way to accomplish what's in our mutual interest.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it, and we'll close here in a second. I have a question. Have you been contracted yet or asked to negotiate Congress?
Well, many have suggested, and I told them I refuse to take on unsolvable problems, but no, but you know, it is interesting how compromise, which is certainly an essential element in the political realm, it's become such a dirty word. It's perceived as capitulation or a sign of weakness. And, you know, I think anybody that's realistic in politics has to realize you're not always going to get everything you want.
Right.
But you know, where can you find some, you know, some equitable solution that helps you accomplish a lot of what you want and also addresses some of the needs of the others? In fact, basically, Congress is designed to do that with all these, okay, we're going to pass this big omnibus, whatever it is, bill you want, but I'm going to attach this rider that, you know, builds a new bridge in my district or whatever. I mean, that's, the system has always been that way for good or bad. But, you know, when we get to a point where we're not open to discussing anything with the other side, and anything they propose we automatically take as something to disagree with, well, I think we've got ourselves in a bad situation, and clearly we're there today where, you know, we should be seeking out ways to do the common good, not ways to just enhance our political standing with those who want us to be unrelenting and inflexible and, you know, and ideologically pure.
There you go. Anybody in Congress who's listening, we got free advice right there from an expert. Gary, I appreciate it very much. I think we covered some things here that are going to make a big difference to people as they start looking about how they can make things happen, how they can connect effectively with other people. If we can get people to do that, we're going to move a long ways to solving a lot of problems in the future. And we have some big problems to overcome as a country and as individuals. So this time has been very helpful for me. I'm sure it's going to be helpful for a lot of people who watch this.
Well, Vic, let me just add one short thing that I just thought of. If you want to take away for your audience and you want to understand how to be a good, responsive listener, an active listener, just focus on two things: restatement of content and reflection of emotions. So when you're talking to somebody, when they're sharing their interesting vacation in Europe, or the problem they're having at work, or whatever it might be, feedback in your words the core of the story they've told you, the problem that they're having with their boss, and then attach to that you reflect back the emotions you hear in how they're responding to that story, that event, that set of facts. If you do those two things, you will be seen and perceived as a good listener and a good communicator, and whether it's dealing with your kids, your spouse, your neighbors, your co-workers, your boss, or somebody with whom you have some significant conflict with. So that's sort of my little tip for the day.
Absolutely, I agree with you 100%. It is the bread and butter of effective communication. You break that loop somehow, and you're losing a whole lot. You're not going to understand enough about the person on the other side to understand how they're going to hear your message unless you have that active feedback loop. So that's fantastic. Gary, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking with you. I've learned a lot just sitting here listening to your dialogue. So hope you have a lot of success. By the way, Gary is doing a lot of public speaking now. He's available for public speaking, and you can find him on his website. And Gary, I'm going to post this in a little bit, but what is the website again?
www.GaryNoesner, one word, GaryNoesner.com. It's got, podcast links and interviews I've done and articles I've written and so forth and so on.
It's a wealth of knowledge if you go there. I was there quite a bit prior to the interview, and I learned a lot more. Also, take some time and look. I think it's still maybe on Netflix. Go back through Waco after watching this video and watch that several times and think about the things we've discussed here, and you're going to find out. Also, if you pick up Gary's book on Amazon or just about any place else you can find your books, you're going to find a wealth of knowledge in that area too. So, Gary, thanks so much for being with us. I'll let you go, and you have a great day.
Thanks, Rick. All the best.
You've been listening to Real Communication with your host, Victor Vogel. Real Communication is produced and edited by Victor Vogel. All rights are copyrighted in 2021. All opinions of Victor Vogel and his guests are their own opinions and don't represent the opinions of any other person or entity. Please subscribe to the podcast and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the upcoming podcasts. You can catch our podcast on Anchor Podcasts or wherever you find your podcasts. You can also find our podcast on our website, realcompod.com or facebook.com/realcompod, and join us also on Twitter at realcompod1. We appreciate all well-meaning reviews, so please leave a review.